You're under arrest for fleeing on foot.
Officer, I'm paralyzed. I can't run.
Stand up.
I can't stand.
Stand up!
There is something profoundly disturbing about watching a man being dragged from his wheelchair by police officers while he desperately tries to explain that he physically cannot commit the crime they are accusing him of. It is the kind of scene that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the justice system in America. And yet, that is exactly what happened to Marcus Thompson on a cold February morning in the city of Riverside Heights, Ohio. What unfolded over the next several hours would expose not just the failures of individual officers, but a systemic rot that allows the innocent to be treated as guilty and the guilty to escape accountability. This is a story about a man who lost the use of his legs more than 2 decades ago, and the day that loss became the very reason he was arrested for a violent crime he could not possibly have committed. It is a story about police officers who saw the truth staring them in the face and chose to ignore it. It is a story about supervisors who could not be bothered to do their jobs. And ultimately, it is a story about what happens when the people sworn to protect us decide that their convenience matters more than our rights. If you find yourself captivated by stories that expose the uncomfortable truths about power and accountability in our society, I encourage you to stay with me until the very end. What you are about to hear will challenge you, infuriate you, and perhaps change the way you think about the relationship between citizens and the institutions meant to serve them. Let us begin where all such stories must begin, with an ordinary day that was about to become anything but ordinary. Marcus Thompson woke up that Thursday morning in February to the sound of sleet tapping against his bedroom window. The weather forecast had promised a mix of rain and ice throughout the day, the kind of gray, miserable weather that made most people want to stay inside. Marcus, however, had errands to run. At 53 years old, he had long since learned that life does not pause for bad weather, and neither could he. He went through his morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it the same way for 22 years. Since that terrible night when he was 20, when a stray bullet from a drive-by shooting severed his spinal cord, Marcus had adapted to life in a wheelchair. It had not been easy. There were years of physical therapy, years of learning to navigate a world built for people who could walk, years of fighting against the depression that threatened to consume him. But Marcus Thompson was not a man who gave up easily. He had built a life for himself, found work, maintained relationships, and carved out his own small piece of dignity in a world that often seemed designed to deny it to him. That morning, as he transferred himself from his bed to his wheelchair with arms that had grown strong from decades of use, Marcus had no idea that his disability, the very thing that had shaped nearly every aspect of his adult life, was about to be dismissed as nothing more than a convenient lie. The apartment Marcus lived in was modest but comfortable. It was located on the ground floor of a small complex on Whitmore Street, a neighborhood that had seen better days but still maintained a sense of community. Marcus knew most of his neighbors by name. They knew him too. They knew he was the man in the wheelchair who always had a kind word, who helped organize the annual block party, who had never once caused any trouble in the 8 years he had lived there. Around 9:30 that morning, Marcus was in his small kitchen preparing a late breakfast. The coffee maker gurgled softly as it finished brewing. Through the window above the sink, he could see the parking lot glistening with a thin layer of ice. He was thinking about whether it was worth venturing out in this weather when he heard the sound that would mark the beginning of his nightmare. 3 sharp knocks on his front door, then a voice loud and commanding. Riverside Heights Police Department. Open the door. Marcus felt his heart rate increase slightly, that instinctive reaction that many people have when police announce themselves unexpectedly. But he was not particularly worried. He had done nothing wrong. Perhaps there had been an incident in the building, or they were conducting some kind of neighborhood canvass. These things happened from time to time. He wheeled himself toward the door, calling out as he went, "Just a minute, I'm coming." When Marcus opened the door, he found himself facing 2 uniformed police officers. The first was a tall man with broad shoulders and a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of suspicion. His nameplate read Officer Derek Holloway. Behind him stood a younger officer, perhaps in his late 20s, who looked slightly uncomfortable. Marcus would later learn this was Officer Ryan Mitchell. Officer Holloway spoke first, his tone flat and businesslike. "Are you Marcus Thompson?" "Yes, that's me. What's this about?" "Mr. Thompson, we have a warrant for your arrest." The words hung in the air for a moment, seemingly disconnected from reality. Marcus blinked, certain he had misheard. "I'm sorry. You said arrest. There must be some kind of mistake. Are you Marcus Allen Thompson, date of birth March 15th, 1971? "Yes, but then there's no mistake. You need to come with us." Marcus's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. An arrest warrant. For what? He had not so much as received a parking ticket in years. His record was clean. This had to be some kind of error, a case of mistaken identity, or a clerical mix-up. "Officer, I don't understand. What am I being arrested for?" Holloway consulted a document in his hand, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "You're wanted for aggravated assault and unlawful entry. The incident occurred on May 23rd of last year." May 23rd. Marcus searched his memory. What had he been doing on May 23rd? It took him a moment to remember. That was the day of his cousin's birthday party. He had spent most of the afternoon and evening at his cousin's house on the other side of the city. There were photographs, witnesses, a dozen people who could confirm his whereabouts. But more importantly, there was a much more fundamental problem with this accusation. "Officer, I need you to listen to me carefully," Marcus said, keeping his voice as calm as he could manage, despite the growing sense of unreality. "I am paralyzed from the waist down. I have been in this wheelchair for 22 years. I cannot walk. I cannot run. I cannot kick in a door or flee on foot, which I'm guessing is what this accusation involves. This has to be some kind of mistake." Officer Holloway looked down at the wheelchair, then back at Marcus's face. His expression did not change. "Sir, I'm just here to execute the warrant. If there's been a mistake, you can sort it out downtown. But I'm telling you, it's physically impossible for me to have done whatever you're accusing me of. Look at my legs." Marcus gestured toward his lower body, where his atrophied legs, thin from 2 decades of disuse, were visible beneath his loose sweatpants. "These haven't worked since I was 20 years old." The younger officer, Mitchell, shifted his weight uncomfortably. He was looking at Marcus's legs, at the wheelchair, at the way the apartment was clearly set up to accommodate someone with limited mobility. The ramps, the grab bars visible through the bathroom door, the specialized equipment scattered throughout the living room. Everything about this scene screamed that this man was genuinely disabled, that he was not faking, that something had gone terribly wrong with this warrant. But Officer Holloway was unmoved. "Like I said, you can explain all that when we get to the station. Right now, I need you to put your hands where I can see them and come with us." This is the moment where everything could have been different. This is where Officer Holloway could have paused, could have looked at the evidence in front of his eyes, could have made a phone call to verify the details of the warrant against the obvious reality of the situation. But he did not. And that decision, that refusal to engage with the blindingly obvious truth, would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately cost him his career. I want you to pause for a moment and consider what you would do in Marcus Thompson's position. You are sitting in your own home, accused of a violent crime you could not possibly have committed, being told by armed officers that your obvious disability is irrelevant to their execution of their duties. The system that is supposed to protect you has suddenly become the instrument of your persecution. What options do you have? What recourse is available to you? The answer, as Marcus was about to discover, is precious little. Officer Holloway stepped forward into the apartment, his partner following behind him. Marcus instinctively rolled his wheelchair backward, not out of an attempt to flee, but simply out of the basic human impulse to create space when feeling threatened. "Sir, I need you to stop moving," Holloway commanded. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm just trying to understand what's happening. Can you at least tell me who accused me of this? What exactly am I supposed to have done?" Holloway glanced at his paperwork again. "The complainant is a woman named Denise Morrison. She alleges that on May 23rd of last year, you forcibly entered her residence on Glenwood Avenue, assaulted her by choking, and then fled the scene on foot." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Denise Morrison. He knew that name. Denise Morrison was his ex-girlfriend's sister. They had dated briefly nearly 2 years ago, and the relationship had ended badly. Not violently, but with hurt feelings and bitter words. He had not seen or spoken to anyone from that family in over a year and a half. "Officer, Denise Morrison knows me. She knows I'm paralyzed. If she told you I kicked in her door and ran away, she's lying. She knows that's impossible." "That's not for me to determine, sir. My job is to bring you in. Now we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His mind was churning through options, looking for some way out of this nightmare. He could refuse to go, but that would only make things worse. He could demand they call their supervisor, but would that even help? The warrant was apparently legitimate, at least on paper. The accusation might be absurd, but the legal machinery had already been set in motion. Can I at least grab my medication? I take pills for blood pressure, and I need them with me. Holloway considered this for a moment, then nodded curtly. "Fine, but make it quick, and don't try anything stupid." Marcus wheeled himself toward the bathroom where he kept his medications, with Officer Mitchell following close behind. As he gathered his prescription bottles, his hands trembling slightly, he tried once more to explain. "Look, I know you're just doing your job, but think about this for a second. The accusation says I kicked in a door and ran away. Does this look like the body of someone who can kick anything? Does this look like someone who can run?" Officer Mitchell, to his credit, seemed genuinely troubled. He lowered his voice, speaking quietly so his partner could not hear from the other room. "Sir, I can see your situation, but we have a warrant. We have to execute it. Once you get to the station, you can explain everything. They'll have to listen. And what if they don't listen? What if they treat me the same way your partner is treating me right now, like I'm some kind of con artist pretending to be disabled?" Mitchell had no answer for that. His silence said everything. They returned to the living room, where Officer Holloway was waiting with his arms crossed. The process of getting Marcus out of the apartment and into the police vehicle was awkward and undignified. The officers had not brought any specialized equipment for transporting a wheelchair-bound individual. Holloway seemed irritated by the logistical complications, as if Marcus's disability was a personal inconvenience designed specifically to make his day more difficult. Outside, the sleet had turned to a light freezing rain. The parking lot was slick and treacherous. Marcus's wheelchair left tracks in the thin layer of ice as the officers guided him toward their patrol car. Neighbors had begun to notice the commotion. A woman from the apartment next door stood on her small porch, watching with wide eyes. An elderly man walking his dog had stopped on the sidewalk, his face a mask of confusion. Marcus felt the weight of their stares. These were people who knew him, who had seen him struggling to navigate icy parking lots in his wheelchair countless times. They knew he was not a violent criminal. They knew something was very wrong with this picture. But what could they do? What could anyone do when the police decided you were guilty? Getting Marcus into the back of the patrol car required both officers to physically lift him from his wheelchair. His legs dangled uselessly as they maneuvered him into the cramped back seat. The wheelchair was folded up and placed in the trunk. Throughout this process, Holloway maintained his stony indifference, handling Marcus like cargo rather than a human being. Mitchell at least showed some care, trying to position Marcus comfortably and making sure his legs were not twisted at painful angles. The ride to the Riverside Heights police station took about 20 minutes. Marcus spent that time staring out the window at the gray, icy streets, his mind oscillating between disbelief and growing fear. He had faith in the system. He had to. Surely once they got to the station, someone with authority would look at this situation and recognize the obvious absurdity. Surely someone would make a phone call, check the facts, and realize that arresting a paraplegic man for a crime that required the use of his legs was a terrible mistake. That faith was about to be severely tested. The station was a squat brick building that dated from the 1970s. Its interior was no more inviting than its exterior. Fluorescent lights, institutional green walls, the smell of stale coffee and cleaning products. Marcus was wheeled through the booking area, drawing curious looks from the officers and civilians present. A paraplegic in handcuffs was not something you saw every day. The booking process began with the standard procedures: photographs, fingerprints, personal information. Throughout, Marcus continued to explain his situation to anyone who would listen. Some officers seemed sympathetic, others were indifferent. None of them had the authority to simply release him. "Look," said one booking officer, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, I understand what you're saying, but we've got a warrant here, and until a judge or a supervisor says otherwise, we have to process you. That's just how it works. Then get me a supervisor. Get me someone who can actually make a decision." The woman sighed, but picked up a phone. After a brief conversation, she hung up and turned back to Marcus. "Lieutenant Brennan will be down to see you. Just sit tight." Sit tight. As if he had any other option. Lieutenant David Brennan arrived about 15 minutes later, and Marcus's heart sank the moment he saw the man. Brennan was in his mid-50s, heavy-set, with the kind of face that suggested he had seen too much and cared too little. He was holding a styrofoam container that smelled of fried food, and his expression made it clear that being called away from his meal was not something he appreciated. "All right, what's the problem here?" Marcus began to explain, going through the whole story again. His paralysis, the impossibility of the accusation, the fact that the alleged victim knew him and knew about his disability. Lieutenant Brennan listened with barely concealed impatience, taking bites of his meal as Marcus spoke. When Marcus finished, Brennan wiped his mouth with a napkin and shrugged. "I hear what you're saying, but we've got a warrant. The complainant identified you. We can't just let you go because you say you didn't do it. Everyone says they didn't do it, but I'm physically incapable of doing what she's accusing me of. That's not just me saying I'm innocent. That's a medical fact. Call my doctor. Call anyone. This is provable within 5 minutes." Brennan was already turning to leave. "You can make your case to the judge. That's not my department." "Lieutenant, please, just look at me. Look at my legs." Does this look like someone who kicked in a door and ran away? Brennan paused at the doorway, turning back to give Marcus a long, appraising look. For a moment, Marcus thought he might have gotten through. Then Brennan spoke, and any hope Marcus had been harboring evaporated. "I've been doing this job for 27 years. I've seen people fake all kinds of things to get out of arrest. Fake heart attacks, fake seizures, fake injuries. For all I know, this whole wheelchair thing is an act. Some people will do anything to avoid consequences." Marcus stared at the lieutenant in disbelief. "You think I've been faking paralysis for 22 years? You think I live in a wheelchair, use grab bars in my bathroom, have atrophied legs that can't support any weight, all as some kind of elaborate long-term scam for a moment exactly like this? Like I said, I've seen a lot of things. You'll get your day in court." And with that, Lieutenant Brennan walked away, returning to his meal and leaving Marcus Thompson to be processed for a crime he could not have committed. This is the point in the story where I need to pause and address something directly. I've been covering cases of injustice and civil rights violations for years now, and I am continually amazed by the capacity of people in positions of authority to willfully ignore evidence when it conflicts with their preconceptions or their convenience. Lieutenant Brennan had every opportunity to investigate this situation properly. A simple phone call to verify Marcus's medical history would have taken 5 minutes. Instead, he chose to suggest that a man who had been paralyzed for over 2 decades was somehow faking his disability. This is not just callousness. This is a fundamental failure of the systems we have put in place to protect innocent people from wrongful prosecution. When a police supervisor cannot be bothered to pause his lunch long enough to investigate an obvious miscarriage of justice, something is deeply broken. For those of you who have been following stories like this on this channel, you know that this kind of behavior is not an aberration. It is a pattern. And until we start holding people like Lieutenant Brennan accountable for their indifference, these patterns will continue. If you believe that accountability matters, if you believe that stories like this need to be told, I hope you will consider subscribing and sharing this video with others who care about these issues. Now, let us return to what happened next. After Lieutenant Brennan's dismissal, Marcus was moved to a holding cell to await further processing. The cell was small, cold, and designed with absolutely no accommodation for someone in a wheelchair. There was a metal bench bolted to the wall and a toilet in the corner with no privacy screen. Marcus could not transfer himself to the bench without assistance, and none was offered. He sat in his wheelchair in the middle of the cell, feeling the cold seep through his clothes, trying to process the absurdity of his situation. Hours passed. Marcus had no way of knowing exactly how long. His blood pressure medication was wearing off, and he could feel the familiar tightness in his chest that signaled his levels were climbing. He called for assistance several times, but the responses were slow and unhelpful. One officer brought him a cup of water. Another told him to be patient. No one seemed interested in addressing the fundamental injustice of his detention. During this time, Marcus had plenty of opportunity to think about Denise Morrison and why she might have made such a transparently false accusation. The answer, when he considered it, was sadly obvious. Denise had been furious when Marcus ended his relationship with her sister, Angela. There had been heated words, accusations, threats of revenge. At the time, Marcus had dismissed it as the heat of the moment, the kind of thing people say when they are hurt, but do not really mean. Clearly, he had been wrong. But here was what made the accusation so baffling. Denise knew about his disability. She had seen him in his wheelchair dozens of times during the year he had dated her sister. She had been present at family dinners where Marcus had needed help reaching things on high shelves. She had watched him struggle to navigate the steps at her mother's house. How could she possibly think that accusing him of kicking in a door and running away would be taken seriously? The answer, Marcus realized with growing horror, was that she did not need the accusation to be believable in the long term. She just needed it to be believed long enough to cause him pain and humiliation. And the police had done exactly what she wanted. They had arrested him without question, processed him without investigation, and left him sitting in a holding cell while his health deteriorated and his dignity was stripped away piece by piece. This is what happens when the system prioritizes process over justice. The warrant was technically valid. The officers were technically following procedure. Everyone could claim they were just doing their job. And yet an innocent man sat in a cold cell, accused of an impossible crime, while no one in the entire apparatus of law enforcement could be bothered to spend 5 minutes verifying the obvious truth. The turning point came several hours later when a new set of officers arrived to transport Marcus to a different facility for arraignment. These officers had not been briefed on the specifics of the case. They saw only the paperwork: aggravated assault, unlawful entry, a male suspect in custody. It was when they entered the holding cell and saw Marcus in his wheelchair that confusion began to spread across their faces. The first officer, a man named Thomas Wright, stopped short at the cell door. "Wait, this is the suspect." Marcus looked up at him with exhausted eyes. "Let me guess. The report says I kicked in someone's door and ran away on foot." Wright nodded slowly, his brow furrowing as he processed what he was seeing. "As you can see, officer, I am paralyzed. I have been for 22 years. I cannot walk. I cannot kick. I cannot run. The accusation is physically impossible, and everyone in this building has been ignoring that fact since I got here." Wright turned to his partner, Officer Lisa Chen, and they exchanged a look that suggested they were finally grasping the enormity of what had happened. Wright pulled out his radio and stepped away from the cell to make a call. Marcus could not hear the conversation, but he could see Wright's expression growing increasingly agitated. When Wright returned to the cell, his demeanor had changed entirely. "Sir, I am deeply sorry for what you've experienced today. I'm going to make some calls and see what we can do to get this sorted out." "I appreciate that, officer. I've been trying to tell everyone the same thing for hours." "I understand. Just give me a few minutes." What followed was a flurry of activity that stood in stark contrast to the indifference Marcus had experienced all day. Wright was on his phone constantly, speaking to supervisors, to the district attorney's office, to anyone who would listen. Chen stayed with Marcus, offering him more water and checking on his well-being. For the first time since his nightmare began, Marcus felt like he was being treated as a human being rather than a problem to be processed. About 45 minutes later, Wright returned with news. "Mr. Thompson, I've spoken with the district attorney on call. Given the circumstances, they're going to decline to prosecute. You're going to be released." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. Thank you for actually listening." "Sir, I want you to know that I'm personally going to be following up on this. What happened to you today was wrong. The officers who arrested you, the supervisor who dismissed your concerns, they all should have done better. I can't promise anything, but I'm going to make sure this gets reported through proper channels." For a moment, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps the system was not completely broken after all. Perhaps there were still people within it who cared about justice, who were willing to speak up when they saw wrongdoing. That hope would prove to be partially justified, but the road ahead would be far from smooth. Before we continue with what happened after Marcus's release, I want to take a moment to address a question that many of you might be asking. How does something like this happen? How does a warrant get issued for someone to be arrested for a crime they physically cannot commit? The answer lies in the gaps between different parts of the justice system. When Denise Morrison filed her complaint, she provided Marcus's name and description. The investigating officers at the time took her statement and, without any additional verification, issued a warrant for Marcus's arrest. There was no follow-up investigation, no attempt to interview the accused, no effort to determine whether the accusation was even plausible. The warrant sat in the system for approximately 10 months, waiting to be served. When Officer Holloway received the assignment to execute the warrant, he saw a piece of paper with a name and a crime. He did not see the person, the context, or the obvious problems with the accusation. This is what systemic failure looks like. It is not necessarily malice at every step. It is indifference, laziness, an unwillingness to question assumptions or verify facts. Each person in the chain does only the minimum required by their narrow role, and no one takes responsibility for the outcome. The result is that innocent people get swept up in a machine that does not care about their innocence. Now let us continue with what happened after Marcus's release. Marcus was officially released from custody at approximately 9:47 that evening, more than 12 hours after his initial arrest. He was exhausted, hungry, and his blood pressure was dangerously elevated from missing his medication for most of the day. But he was free, and as he wheeled himself out of the police station into the cold night air, he made a decision. This was not going to end with his release. The people who had wronged him were going to be held accountable. Over the following weeks, Marcus began the process of filing complaints and seeking legal representation. He documented everything he could remember about his arrest and detention, the officers' names, their words, the way they had handled him, Lieutenant Brennan's dismissive attitude, the hours spent in a cell that could not accommodate his disability. Finding a lawyer willing to take on a case against the police department was not easy. Many attorneys he contacted were sympathetic but reluctant. Cases against law enforcement are notoriously difficult to win, and the financial investment required is substantial. But Marcus persisted, and eventually he connected with an attorney named Victoria Sanchez, who specialized in civil rights cases. Victoria was immediately interested in Marcus's case. "This is exactly the kind of situation that demonstrates how broken the system is," she told him during their first meeting. "You have a complainant who filed what appears to be a false report, officers who ignored obvious evidence of innocence, and a supervisor who suggested you were faking a 2-decade-long disability. This isn't just about getting you compensation, it's about forcing accountability." What happened next would unfold over several months, but I am going to share with you the key developments and their outcomes. First, there was the matter of the body camera footage. Officer Holloway, like all officers in the Riverside Heights Police Department, was equipped with a body camera that recorded his interactions while on duty. The footage from Marcus's arrest was subpoenaed as part of the investigation, and what it revealed was even more damning than Marcus had remembered. The footage showed Officer Holloway approaching Marcus's apartment, knocking on the door, and immediately treating Marcus as a threat despite his obvious disability. It showed Marcus calmly explaining his condition, pointing to his legs, demonstrating that he could not stand. It showed Holloway dismissing every word with barely concealed contempt. But the most revealing moment came during the transport to the station. At one point, Officer Mitchell, the younger officer who had seemed troubled by the arrest, spoke up. "Derek, I think he might be telling the truth. I mean, look at him. There's no way he kicked in a door." Holloway's response was captured clearly by the audio. "Don't worry about it. These people will say anything to avoid getting locked up. Probably hurt his back lifting a TV he stole, and now he's playing it up." The casual racism embedded in that statement, the assumption that Marcus, a black man, must be a criminal playing an angle, was not lost on anyone who reviewed the footage. It became a central element of the civil rights complaint. The footage from the station was equally disturbing. It showed Lieutenant Brennan barely looking at Marcus as he explained his situation, more focused on his meal than on the obvious injustice being perpetrated. It captured his dismissive comment about having seen people fake all kinds of conditions. It documented his refusal to spend even a few minutes investigating before walking away. When Victoria Sanchez presented this footage to the department's Internal Affairs Division, along with medical records confirming Marcus's paralysis dating back 22 years, the investigation began to accelerate. I want to pause here and ask you something. Think about what Marcus Thompson went through that day. The fear of being arrested for a crime he did not commit. The humiliation of being dragged from his wheelchair by officers who saw his disability as an inconvenience rather than a fact. The hours spent in a cell designed for able-bodied detainees. The knowledge that a supervisor had suggested his paralysis was an act. How would you feel in that situation? What would you want to happen to the people responsible? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I am genuinely curious to hear your perspectives on this, because what happened next in terms of accountability is something that I think reveals a lot about how our system actually works. The Internal Affairs investigation concluded approximately 4 months after Marcus filed his formal complaint. The findings were mixed, and the disparities in outcomes reveal much about how police departments handle misconduct. Officer Derek Holloway was found to have violated departmental policy in several significant ways. He failed to properly evaluate exculpatory evidence at the scene, specifically Marcus's obvious physical disability. He made comments during the arrest that demonstrated racial bias. He did not follow proper procedures for transporting a disabled individual. Based on these findings, Officer Holloway was terminated from the Riverside Heights Police Department. On paper, this looks like accountability. An officer who acted improperly was fired. Justice was served. But the story does not end there, and the details of what happened next reveal the limits of this kind of accountability. First, Officer Holloway's termination came with no criminal charges, despite effectively kidnapping and falsely imprisoning a man for a crime he could not have committed. Holloway faced no legal consequences beyond losing his job. He was free to apply for positions at other police departments, and indeed, records suggest that he was hired by a smaller department in a neighboring county within a year of his termination. This is a pattern we see repeatedly in cases of police misconduct. Officers who are fired for cause simply move to a different jurisdiction and continue their careers. There is no national database tracking problem officers, no system for ensuring that someone fired for racial bias and wrongful arrest cannot simply pin on a badge somewhere else and continue the same behavior. The accountability is temporary, localized, and easily circumvented. Second, and perhaps more troubling, Lieutenant David Brennan faced no discipline whatsoever. The Internal Affairs investigation found that while Brennan's handling of the situation was not ideal, he had not technically violated any departmental policies. His dismissive attitude toward Marcus's claims, his suggestion that the paralysis might be faked, his refusal to spend any time investigating the obvious problems with the arrest, none of this rose to the level of actionable misconduct under the department's rules. Let that sink in for a moment. A supervising officer suggested that a man who had been paralyzed for 22 years was faking his disability, refused to investigate an obviously flawed arrest, and walked away to finish his lunch while an innocent man sat in a holding cell. And, according to the official investigation, none of that was a violation of policy. This is what systemic failure looks like at the policy level. The rules are written in ways that protect those in authority from accountability. A low-ranking officer who makes a bad arrest can be sacrificed, but a supervisor who enables and endorses that bad arrest through his indifference is protected by the vagueness of his responsibilities. As long as he does not explicitly order wrongdoing, he cannot be held responsible for failing to prevent it. Marcus Thompson's reaction to these findings was a mixture of vindication and frustration. "I'm glad Holloway is gone," he told a reporter at the time. But Brennan is still there, still supervising other officers, still in a position to make the same mistakes. What happens when the next person comes through with an obvious case of innocence and Brennan is too busy eating his dinner to care? It was a question that the department never adequately answered. The civil lawsuit proceeded on a parallel track to the internal investigation. Victoria Sanchez filed suit against the city of Riverside Heights, the police department, and the individual officers involved, alleging violations of Marcus's civil rights under multiple federal statutes. The case sought compensatory damages for the physical and emotional harm Marcus had suffered, as well as punitive damages designed to punish the defendants for their conduct and deter future misconduct. The city's response was predictable: deny everything, claim qualified immunity for the officers, argue that they were just following procedures and could not be held responsible for any errors. The legal battle that followed was lengthy and complicated, stretching out over more than a year as motions were filed, depositions were taken, and both sides prepared for a potential trial. In the end, the case was settled out of court. The terms of the settlement were confidential, but sources familiar with the matter suggested that Marcus received a significant sum in compensation. More importantly for Marcus, the settlement included provisions requiring the department to review and revise its policies regarding the arrest and detention of disabled individuals. Whether those policy changes will actually prevent future incidents like Marcus's remains to be seen. History suggests that policy reforms following settlements are often implemented weakly, if at all, and rarely survive changes in department leadership. There is one more aspect of this case that deserves attention: the fate of Denise Morrison, the woman who made the false accusation that started this entire chain of events. When the facts of Marcus's case became public, questions immediately arose about whether Denise should face criminal charges for filing a false police report. After all, she had accused a paraplegic man of a crime that required the use of his legs. She knew about his disability. The accusation was not a mistake or a misidentification. It was, by all appearances, a deliberate lie designed to harm someone she disliked. The district attorney's office declined to prosecute. Their reasoning was that proving the accusation was knowingly false would be difficult. Denise could claim she genuinely believed Marcus had somehow recovered the use of his legs, or that she had confused him with someone else, or any number of other excuses. Even if those claims were patently ridiculous, the burden of proving criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt was, in the DA's assessment, too high. This is another systemic failure that this case exposed. False accusations have devastating consequences for their targets, but accusers rarely face meaningful consequences even when their lies are exposed. The system is weighted heavily toward believing accusers and prosecuting the accused, with little recourse when that system is weaponized by bad actors. Marcus Thompson expressed his frustration with this outcome in an interview given after his lawsuit was settled. "Denise Morrison ruined a day of my life, damaged my health, and put me through trauma that I still deal with today. And nothing happened to her. She's walking around free, probably laughing about how she got away with it. What's to stop her from doing the same thing to someone else?" It was a question without a satisfying answer. As we approach the end of this story, I want to reflect on what it tells us about justice, accountability, and the systems we have built to protect the innocent. Marcus Thompson's case is not unique. Every year, thousands of people in this country are arrested on warrants that should never have been issued for crimes they did not or could not have committed. Most of them do not have the resources, the knowledge, or the support to fight back. They take plea deals to avoid the risk of worse outcomes at trial. They accept the injustice as the cost of existing in a system that does not care about them. Marcus was fortunate in some ways. He had documentation of his disability going back decades. He encountered at least one officer, Thomas Wright, who was willing to see the obvious truth and act on it. He found a lawyer willing to take his case. But none of those things should have been necessary. The injustice was obvious from the moment Officer Holloway knocked on Marcus's door and saw a man in a wheelchair being accused of kicking in a door and fleeing on foot. The system failed at every level. It failed when the original accusation was accepted without investigation. It failed when the warrant was issued without anyone questioning its plausibility. It failed when officers ignored Marcus's explanation and proceeded with an arrest they knew was problematic. It failed when Lieutenant Brennan chose his dinner over a few minutes of basic inquiry. It failed when Internal Affairs found no policy violation in Brennan's conduct. It failed when the district attorney declined to prosecute a woman who had weaponized the criminal justice system against an innocent man. And here is the hardest truth of all. For every Marcus Thompson whose story gets told, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds, whose stories never see the light of day. People who lack the resources to fight. People who are not as sympathetic to juries or journalists. People who simply give up in the face of a system that does not want to admit its mistakes. What can we do about this? That is a question I think about constantly, and I do not have easy answers. I believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant, that telling these stories and forcing them into public consciousness is part of the solution. I believe that policy reforms, while imperfect, can make a difference if they are implemented seriously and monitored closely. I believe that individual officers who see wrongdoing have a moral obligation to speak up, as Officer Wright did, even when it is uncomfortable. But mostly, I believe that change will only come when enough people demand it, when enough voters make it clear that they will not accept this kind of injustice from their public servants, when enough pressure is brought to bear on prosecutors, police chiefs, and elected officials to prioritize justice over convenience. That is where you come in. If this story moved you, if it made you angry or sad, or determined to see things change, do not let that feeling fade when you close this video. Share it with others. Talk about it with your friends and family. When you vote, remember cases like Marcus Thompson's and ask yourself whether the candidates on your ballot will make things better or worse. I want to close with an update on Marcus Thompson himself. Despite everything he went through, Marcus has chosen to become an advocate for others who have experienced similar injustices. He speaks at community events about the importance of knowing your rights when interacting with police. He volunteers with organizations that provide legal assistance to people who have been wrongfully arrested. He has turned his trauma into a force for positive change in his community. "What happened to me was terrible," Marcus said in a recent interview. "But if I can use it to help someone else avoid the same experience, or to push for changes that make the system fairer, then at least some good will have come out of it. I refuse to let what they did to me define me. I'm going to define what comes next." That is a powerful message, and one that I think we can all take to heart. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it resonated with you, I would be grateful if you would hit the subscribe button and share this video with others who care about justice and accountability. Every view, every share, every subscription helps spread the word about cases like Marcus Thompson's and keeps pressure on the systems and institutions that need to do better. And I have one final question for you to consider, one that I hope you will answer honestly in the comments. If you were Officer Holloway standing at Marcus Thompson's door, seeing a man in a wheelchair accused of kicking in a door and fleeing on foot, what would you have done differently? And if you were Lieutenant Brennan, would you have put down your meal long enough to investigate? I think most of us would like to believe we would do the right thing. But would we really? These are the questions that stories like this force us to confront. Until next time, remember, our rights do not end where fear or inconvenience begin. Justice is messy, accountability is hard, and none of it happens without people who are willing to pay attention and speak up. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.